All right, welcome back to the Euthyphro conversation. So I ended on sort of the question of the Euthyphro dilemma. And we're going to talk about what a dilemma is in a second, but here's what it is. Is it right? Because God says it's right. Or is it, help if I use the right language, right? Or does God say it's right? Because it's right. Now, in the Euthyphro, Socrates is not treating Euthyphro well. You could see this sort of in the back and forth. Euthyphro goes through several attempts to define what piety is, and we're just going to say piety here means what's right. And we can see this come out a little bit in what Socrates says when he says, look, Euthyphro, you and I get in a debate about how many objects are in a room. Are we going to have a war about that? Or are we just going to try to recount? And Euthyphro's like, well, we're going to try to recount. Why would we fight about that? And he's like, okay, fair. The gods, when they get into a war, are they fighting about something like the number of objects in a room, or are they fighting about stuff that really matters? And Euthyphro says, well, stuff that really matters. And Socrates is like, so what really matters? Stuff like what's just, right? And Euthyphro's like, yeah. And so we know that what Socrates, or Plato, is getting at here is what's underlying piety. Like the gods love what's right. They love what's just. So the question is, do they love what's just because they say it's just, or do they love it because it's just? So we can see some of this coming out even though they're talking in the language of piety and pagan gods, right? So Euthyphro, he first says that what's pious is punishing people who break the rules. And then Socrates is like, well, that doesn't sound right to me. He's like, you're right. So piety is what the gods love. Socrates is like, well, don't the gods argue? He's like, well, yeah. So it's what all the gods love. And so that's why we end up in this question of, well, right, do the gods love it because they love it? This is weird. This is where he talks about the caring versus being loved sort of discussion. This might be very confusing to you. Do the gods love it because they love it, or do they love it because it's a thing worth loving? Is basically the question. So just to put a little bit of more time and discussion into this, like carried versus being carried, loved versus being loved. I think it's important to note, one, this is translated from ancient Greece. Two, lots of ink has been spilled about what's going on in these particular sections. So this is like 10E, 10D, something like that. Lots of ink has been spilled about this. Basically, the one argument here is that like Socrates is just making what's called an equivocation. It's a type of fallacy. So in the discussion of carried versus being carried, that seems fine. But then when he moves into love versus being loved or beloved, it's not exactly the same sort of semantic rules. But we can set that aside and talk about what's actually going on here. Is he saying, look, if you say something is just because it's loved, it's the same as saying something is carried because it's a thing that's carried, or it's a carried thing, excuse me. So he's like, look, saying something is loved because it's loved is the same as saying it's carried as an essence, as an essential property of the thing. When in reality, it's a carried thing because it's being carried. It's loved because it's loved, right? So if you say like, okay, piety is what the gods love, that's fine. But the gods, what do the gods love? Well, they love justice. So is it justice because it's loved? Or is it loved because it's justice? That's really what's going on in this little discussion about carried versus being carried, beloved versus being beloved. It's really just this question that we asked up here, right? And which I will reiterate for you here. Is it just because God loves it? Or is it loved because it's just? Right? Are you beloved because you're loved? Are you beloved because there's something worth loving about you? That's all that's going on here. And it's a really complicated language, but that's fine. Because if you can just remember that what's really going on here is this question of, do the gods love it because it's just, or is it just because they love it? If you can keep that distinction in mind, then you're doing just fine. And where do we get this dilemma from, though? Because a dilemma is when you have two options that aren't really great and you have to pick one. So what's going on here? Well, one, Euthyphro is endorsing this thing that we call divine command theory, which you might be familiar with. It's just maybe under a different name. Divine command theory is just the idea that what's right is what God commands. So for instance, you might have heard somebody say, if God tells me to jump off this building, I'd do it because God told me to do it. So underlining that is this idea of divine command theory. What's right is what God commands. Euthyphro is tacitly endorsing this, right? Why am I trying my father for murder? Well, because the gods demand it. And they demand it through the fact that they think it's piety. Okay, well, if that's the case, then either X is right, we mean morally right, ethically right. X is right because God says so, or, and this little sign here just means or, it's a logical symbol, or X is right and God is just telling us. So conveying information. So 3, and I'm going to label these real quick. So this first half of the disjunct, either X, so, sorry. I'm going to call this A. Okay, X is right because God says so. That's the first part of the disjunct, and B is the second part where X is right and God is just telling us. Okay, so if A, then morality is arbitrary. Okay, why? And I'm skipping some steps in the argument here to make it clear. So why is this the case? Well, God can change his mind. All right. 4, if B, you guys might benefit from an instructor who could write. If B, then God doesn't make things morally right. Therefore, if divine command theory is true, then either morality is arbitrary, and arbitrary here means just up to God's will. And we're going to explain why that's a bad thing, or could be a bad thing. Or God doesn't decide what's moral. So why worry about this, it being up to God's will? Well, one, there's examples of God changing his mind. Not necessarily being wrong. I don't want to say that because it implies some things. But he does change his mind. And so we can ask this question, right? Can God make it moral to shove a hot needle into a dog's eye, into a puppy dog's eye? Okay, and if your answer to this is no, then you are rejecting divine command theory. If your answer to this is yes, then you're accepting divine command theory and biting the bullet on the first half of this disjunct, right? Basic idea here is that God can just change what's moral and make it such that you're obligated to do it. So if he says, look, you should do what's moral, I commanded of you, I think shoving a needle into a puppy dog's eye is morally correct, then you're obligated to do that. That's the logic of divine command theory. And you may reject this. You may say, like, look, God isn't going to order me to do something cruel. Why not? right? Cruelty is up to your mind to decide. What's right is up to God on this view. So we don't want morality to be arbitrary. And we could pick any religious tradition and go find ourselves an example of God ordering something that we consider to be inhumane. And you might say, like, Layla, you're taking those stories out of context. Well, recontextualize them for me. Because God commands Abraham to go kill his son Isaac. Abraham's ready to do that. Why? Because he thinks God would not command him to do something wrong. He's taking it on faith. It wouldn't happen. Goes up the mountain, God intervenes, right? This is a story of God ordering somebody to do something that to a human mind is ostensibly cruel, ostensibly wrong, but God commands it. So if God ordered you to shove a needle into a puppy dog's eye, you kind of have to if you accept divine command theory. Morality is arbitrary. It can be changed at God's will and not relative to us. Now, you can always say here in response, like, look, God made us a particular type of creature. Because of that, there's certain things that keep us from flourishing, so God would never command these things. Sure. It's not the point. The point is that he could. The other half of this is God doesn't decide what's moral. Okay, why do we care about this? Well, remember, God is morally perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful, makes all the rules, so to speak. So if he doesn't decide what's moral, then what's moral is objective, right? Maybe not objective, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's so completely subjective, and we don't have any reason to think that morality is constant. What's right is constant, right? That's problematic for other reasons. But the point is, if we're going to ask this question of where do moral principles come from, we might be hesitant to accept divine command theory because it makes morality arbitrary, right? Think about this, for example. Early on in lots of religious traditions, if you were not of the same faith, you were mistreated. That's still true in a lot of places today. That's commanded in some religious texts, and some pieces of religious text. We might think there's something wrong with that, morally wrong with that. If that's the case, then you are denying divine command theory. If you think that, well, no, God is just conveying information to us, he's not going to tell us something that's not true, well, then God doesn't decide what's moral, and there's some sort of limitation on God that if you're somebody like Euthyphro, you may not want to accept. Because remember, Euthyphro is a religious extremist trying to prosecute his dad for murder because he thinks it's impious not to, right? So this is a tough sell. I know that you might be thinking to yourself, like, well, God would never do X, God would never do Y. But that's not the point. The point here is to follow the logic. This isn't a reductio, right? If you think that what is right is what God commands, then there's only a few ways that pans out, right? If that's the case, then either it's arbitrary, God can change his mind, or God doesn't decide what's moral. So the question really underlying this Euthyphro dilemma is, where do our moral principles come from? There are a couple options. You can say that they're objective, they're just out there. You can tie them to the type of creature we are. You can say, well, we don't actually have moral facts of the matter. We just have things that we like more or less. There's all sorts of views you can take on this. But we might want to resist the divine command theory for the reasons stated. Real quick before I end this, it's possible and probably likely that this isn't a real dilemma. Just want to put that out there. There's a way out. Lots of people have argued it. For instance, morality is really demanding, so we need God to make it plausible. Or look, without something like divine command theory, we can't hold people accountable for bad actions, right? Because they're too powerful while they're alive, but when they die, they're going to be held accountable. There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to endorse something like this. But additionally, within the text of the Euthyphro, this is presented as a logical contradiction. Like, Euthyphro is contradicting himself by positing the divine command theory. It's not clear to me and other readers that there's actually a logical contradiction here. So, if you want to be a divine command theorist, you don't have to be, by the way, in order to be religious. You don't have to have this view. In fact, there's nothing to my knowledge, any of the major religious texts that require you to be a divine command theorist. If you want to be a divine command theorist, you have several routes you can take to defend the position, but you can't just say, like, that wouldn't happen, right? That's not, you need a reason to say that wouldn't happen. That's my whole point. See you guys on the flip side when we move in from this meta-ethical question of where moral principles come from to actual questions about what makes things right and wrong.